For years, I've been the family's invisible backbone, the one who pays the bills, smooths over fights, and keeps everything running. You'd think that would earn me some gratitude, but at our weekly Sunday dinners, I'm the responsible bore, the forgotten daughter, the one everyone forgets to thank. Last week, I quietly paid $3,200 to fix Mom's leaky roof. Not a single word of thanks, just Eleanor's smirk from across the table, like she was the queen surveying her kingdom. Eleanor Murphy, my cousin, the ever-watchful predator, sat nearby, her eyes sharp and calculating, always ready to pounce on any sign of weakness. The air was thick with forced smiles and half-hearted laughter, but beneath it all, tension hummed like a low electric current. I sat there, my hands wrapped around my teacup, feeling the weight of the unspoken, the invisible labor that kept this family glued together. They leaned on me, drained me, yet treated me like I was some inconvenience. I have a secret few know, a deep, painstaking knowledge of our family's tangled finances and legal documents. Years of quietly piecing together trust documents, loan agreements, wills. It's my hidden armor. Yet, so far, I've kept it locked away, just a quiet observer in this family drama. But inside me, something was shifting. The cracks in my patience were growing, subtle yet unmistakable. I didn't yet know how far this battle would stretch, but I felt the first tremors of change. This injustice, this invisible servitude, it wouldn't last forever. I remember one birthday party when I was about 10, sitting in the corner clutching a modestly wrapped gift while Eleanor basked in the spotlight. She was 4 years older, already practiced in charming the room. That day, she received lavish presents, loud applause, and an adoring smile from Mom. Grace Turner, our mother, whispered to me with a sigh, "Eleanor's the golden child. You're different." Those words stung more than I let on, but I buried the hurt deep, convincing myself this was my role, the responsible one, the steady anchor to Eleanor's wild storms. Over the years, that imbalance only deepened. Eleanor's reckless spending and dazzling charm won the family's admiration, while I quietly footed the bills, repaired the emotional cracks, and carried the weight no one saw. I remember lending Eleanor $5,000 once for a business idea she swore would change everything. That money vanished into thin air, and behind closed doors, she mocked me for being naive. Yet I told myself it was just part of the family dynamic, a sacrifice for peace. The pattern was clear. Eleanor took, I gave. Mother's eyes always lingered longer on Eleanor, praising her energy and spirit, while I faded further into the background. I rationalized it as love, but in truth, it was a slow erosion of my worth, a toxicity I was too blind to recognize. Over the last decade, my sacrifices have been concrete and countless. More than $150,000 lent to family members, mostly Eleanor, loans and gifts that never saw a cent returned. I gave Eleanor $50,000 for her wedding, money that vanished as if it were never there. I passed up a promotion at work, missing out on $20,000 in bonuses, all to care for our ailing grandmother, who needed constant attention. I've been the family ATM and the emotional sponge, absorbing their crises while my own needs vanished into the background. Daniel, my husband, is my quiet anchor. He's always there, urging me gently to stand up for myself, though he respects my cautious nature. Marcus, my younger brother, watches all this unfold with a skeptical eye. He suspects Eleanor's manipulations but says little in public, caught in his own conflict between loyalty and truth. My secret power is the detailed understanding I hold of our family's tangled trust fund and the legal clauses buried within, especially one about mental health that Eleanor now threatens to exploit to seize control. Despite all I've given, Eleanor still dominates the family's attention and resources. The gap between us grows wider, a chasm forged from favoritism and betrayal, and I'm left wondering how much longer I can hold the line. The Sunday dinner was crowded, noisy, the clatter of forks against plates and murmurs filling the room. Then came Eleanor's words, sharp and cold. "Maybe Hannah's just too unstable to manage her own finances." She said it loud enough for cousins, aunts, everyone, dragging up a minor anxiety episode I'd trusted only Daniel with. Maybe that's why she's always hiding behind spreadsheets and excuses? She sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. The room froze. Grace, our mother, smirked and quickly changed the subject, as if to dismiss the accusation like a pesky fly. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. My cheeks burned, humiliation flooding me like a sudden wave. I wanted to stand up, to protest, to reclaim my dignity, but I bit my tongue. Fear of stirring the pot, of escalation, held me back. Still, inside, I told myself Eleanor's words were desperate attacks, not truths. They were weapons thrown in the dark, meant to wound but not to define me. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted, a quiet, gnawing ache that burrowed beneath my skin. I vowed silently, this won't define me. But in that moment, I felt small, unseen, and deeply wounded. The moment I dared to push back against Eleanor's relentless dominance, the backlash was swift and merciless. It was as if I'd poked a hornet's nest, and the swarm descended with venomous precision. Rumors began to spread like wildfire, whispered in hushed tones at family gatherings and muttered behind my back at work. Eleanor, with her practiced charm, painted a picture of me as unstable, unreliable, and unfit, words that felt like icy daggers carving through my heart. At the last holiday brunch, I caught the glance of Aunt Susan, who'd once been warm, now cool and distant, her eyes flicking away whenever I met them. Eleanor's flying monkeys were everywhere. Her closest friends and a few family relatives who eagerly echoed her narrative, sending me cold, veiled messages through text and social media. "Hope you're feeling okay, Hannah," read one message from a once friendly cousin, dripping with false concern. "Everyone's worried about you," chimed another. At the office, colleagues who shared family ties began to treat me differently, offering cautious smiles, dropping invitations to lunch, and making offhand remarks about my stress levels and emotional fragility. It was a subtle, suffocating isolation that crept into every corner of my life. Worse still was Eleanor's gaslighting, a slow, deliberate attempt to make me question my own memory and sanity. During one family dinner, she casually contradicted a story I'd told dozens of times, insisting I was confused about the timeline of a loan I'd made to her. "That never happened the way you say, Hannah," she said with a patronizing tilt of her head. "Maybe you're mixing things up." Her words echoed in my mind long after, leaving me second-guessing myself. Was I losing grip, or was this just another cruel manipulation? The psychological warfare was exhausting. I caught myself scanning every interaction for hidden meanings, hesitating before speaking, afraid my words would be twisted against me. Even Marcus seemed wary, his protective instinct battling with the pressure to stay neutral in the fractured family dynamic. Daniel held me tight at night, whispering that I wasn't alone, but the loneliness gnawed at me during the day. The once familiar rooms of family gatherings felt like hostile territory, where every smile masked a knife aimed at my back. Despite the quiet storm raging around me, I clung to civility, determined to maintain my dignity, even as Eleanor's campaign chipped away at my sense of belonging and trust. The family I'd anchored my life around was fracturing, and I was left to pick up the pieces alone. On a chilly Sunday afternoon, I decided enough was enough. I arranged for a family mediation during our usual Sunday dinner, hoping that face-to-face confrontation might finally clear the air. I prepared meticulously, gathering detailed records of every financial contribution I'd made over the years, loan receipts, bank statements, and timelines of support. I rehearsed my words, determined to present my case with calm clarity. When the family gathered around the long oak table, I took a deep breath and spoke. "I've always acted in the family's best interest," I said, voice steady despite the fluttering nerves. "Every dollar I've given, every hour spent was to support us, to keep this family afloat." I laid out my evidence carefully, hoping the facts would be undeniable. Eleanor, predictably, responded with a flood of emotion. She accused me of paranoia and exaggeration, painting me as delusional and obsessed with control. Grace, our mother, sided with Eleanor without hesitation, her gaze sharp and dismissive. "Hannah, you always see problems where there aren't any," she said, shaking her head. The mediator, a distant uncle, seemed more interested in maintaining a superficial peace than hearing the truth. He brushed off my evidence as technicalities and urged everyone to focus on family harmony. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the air thick with betrayal and misunderstanding. I left that dinner feeling crushed, my attempts at peace dismissed as overreaction. The divide between Eleanor and me yawned wider, a chasm of distrust and resentment that no amount of mediation could bridge. The bitter taste of failure lingered long after the guests had gone. I realized then that this family conflict wasn't just stubborn, it was impenetrable. My hope for reconciliation, for understanding, was fading. The walls around me were closing tighter, and I found myself sinking deeper into isolation. The person who had once been the family's rock was now a pariah in her own home. The fight wasn't just about money or legacy anymore. It was about survival, holding on to my dignity in a sea of accusations and doubt. The funeral of our grandmother should have been a solemn, unifying moment, a time for shared grief and quiet remembrance. Instead, it became another battlefield in Eleanor's war against me. As family members gathered in the dimly lit chapel, I was blindsided by Eleanor's calculated public attack. With a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, she questioned my mental fitness to serve as executor of the will. Given Hannah's anxiety, I think it's clear she's not capable of managing our grandmother's affairs, she declared, her tone dripping with feigned concern. The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. The room shifted uncomfortably. Whispered conversations sparked in the pews, and some distant relatives exchanged skeptical glances. I felt the sting of humiliation burn my cheeks as Eleanor's insinuations echoed through the chapel. The will contained a clause allowing the removal of executors deemed unstable, a legal sword hanging by a fragile thread over my head. I could see the doubt creeping into the eyes of family lawyers present, their demeanor shifting subtly as Eleanor's subtle whispers poisoned their perception. The damage was tangible and swift. I lost the chance to manage the inheritance, a responsibility I'd prepared for and deserved. The respect I had hoped to maintain among distant relatives crumbled, replaced by whispered gossip and thinly veiled pity. Several family friends later confided in Marcus, their words laced with condescension about my supposed fragile state. It was a public and professional blow, the kind that reverberates through both personal and work worlds. I sat in the back of the chapel, hands clenched tightly in my lap, feeling my remaining confidence shatter like glass on cold stone. Eleanor's ruthless intent was undeniable. This was no mere rivalry, but a calculated campaign to dismantle my life piece by piece. The cost of her cruelty wasn't just financial, it was the erosion of my identity, the stripping away of the respect I had quietly earned over decades. And yet, beneath the shame and hurt, a small, stubborn flame of resolve flickered. I refused to let this be my breaking point. Later that week, desperate for some semblance of peace, I sought a private meeting with Eleanor and Grace. The air between us was thick with tension, the walls of the room pressing in as I laid bare everything I'd held inside. "I need respect," I said, voice trembling but clear. "Not these attacks and lies. I just want fairness in the inheritance, an acknowledgement of what I've done for this family." I offered to step back from my role as executor if it meant a fair share of the trust, a compromise to end the hostility. But Eleanor's eyes were cold, her tone dismissive as she cut me off. "You're unstable, Hannah. That disqualifies you," she said flatly, as if my worth was a mere footnote in her quest for power. Grace nodded silently beside her, the weight of their rejection pressing down like a suffocating fog. In that moment, the line was drawn in stone. This wasn't a disagreement to be resolved. It was a power grab, and I was the obstacle to be erased. The emotional toll crashed over me in waves, crushing, isolating, yet clarifying. Eleanor would never acknowledge my worth. The finality of their refusal marked the death of any hope for peace. I sat there, heart aching, the quiet storm inside me swelling. This was no longer a family dispute. It was war. After that humiliating meeting, the walls of my world felt like they were closing in, inch by inch, suffocating whatever hope I'd clung to. The people who had once given me hesitant nods or whispered encouragements now kept their distance, retreating as if my presence carried some contagious disgrace. Even Marcus, my brother, who'd always been my quiet support, grew cautious in public, offering no more than a strained smile or an averted gaze when we crossed paths at family events. The once lively Sunday dinners became cold, sterile affairs, where I sat at the periphery, a ghost among the laughter and clinking glasses. Conversations hushed whenever I entered the room, or abruptly stopped, leaving me stranded in a silence louder than any accusation. Grace, our mother, barely looked my way, her eyes favoring Eleanor with a warmth I would never receive. I forced myself to eat, to keep my voice steady when spoken to, but inside I was unraveling, wondering if Eleanor's poisonous words held some truth. Was I really unstable? Was all my careful composure just a fragile facade? Doubt gnawed relentlessly at me, echoing in every whispered comment and sideways glance. The financial pressure tightened its grip next. Eleanor, with a casual cruelty, began blocking any attempt I made to recover money I'd lent over the years. Messages went unanswered, excuses piled up, and my bank statements grew increasingly alarming. The credit lines I'd relied on shrank, and the security I'd built began to crumble. I sat alone in my study late into the night, staring at the spreadsheets and loan agreements I'd meticulously maintained, feeling the weight of every unpaid debt as a personal failure. The quiet rage simmered beneath my skin, a fire igniting even as my body trembled with exhaustion. I refused to let this be the end of my story. Despite the crushing loneliness, despite the shrinking circle of allies, I could feel something hardening inside me, a slow but steady resolve that whispered, "You are not invisible. You are not defeated." I was battered, yes, but not broken. And even in the darkest moments, I clung to that stubborn ember of defiance, knowing that somewhere beneath the doubt, my true strength was waiting to rise. The next Sunday dinner was a reckoning. As I took my seat, the room buzzed with a tension I hadn't felt before, a charged silence that prickled my skin. Eleanor was radiant, her smile sharp and victorious, like a queen surveying her conquered realm. Then, with a dramatic flourish, she pulled out a document, a forged medical report, expertly doctored to paint me as dangerously unstable. Her voice was cold, clinical, as she read aloud the damning conclusions, accusing me of mental deterioration that supposedly made me unfit to make any decisions about the inheritance. The room froze, the air thick with disbelief and shock. Grace's face was unreadable, but her quick nod to Eleanor spoke volumes. The trustee of the family trust appeared moments later, officially freezing my access to the trust's funds. I felt the blood drain from my face, the financial lifeline I had depended on, severed in an instant. The silence that followed was unbearable. Eyes darted between me and Eleanor, some filled with pity, others with thinly veiled judgment. The whispered questions that had haunted me now felt like accusations shouted in an empty room. My heart shattered, every pulse echoing the betrayal. But then, beneath the ache, something shifted. The humiliation, the erasure, the betrayal, they became a furnace forging a new clarity inside me. This wasn't the end. They thought they could silence me and steal what was mine, but they had forgotten who I was. The woman who had quietly held this family together was still standing. My victimhood evaporated, replaced by a fierce, cold clarity. This breaking point was not a collapse. It was an awakening. I would fight back, not with tears or pleas, but with every ounce of strength and knowledge I had. I would become the storm they never saw coming. In the solitude of my home that night, I replayed every moment, every cutting word, every dismissive glance, the years of sacrifice, the endless giving with no thanks, the betrayals wrapped in family smiles, all of it washed over me in a relentless tide. I saw the pattern laid bare. Eleanor's jealousy masked as concern, Grace's blind favoritism, the family's willful blindness to the truth. Anger surged through me. Not the shallow anger of a moment, but a deep, burning fury born from years of being used and discarded. I acknowledged the pain, but I refused to let it cripple me. Instead, I let it fuel me. I thought about the claws Eleanor had twisted against me, the mental health provision she weaponized. I had read and understood it in detail many times, A secret knowledge I now held like a beacon in the dark. That weapon was loaded, but so was I. I wasn't the fragile woman they painted me to be. I was a strategist, a keeper of truths hidden in legalese and financial statements. I promised myself then, in that quiet room filled with my own breath and determination, that I would never again let them define me. I would reclaim my dignity, my inheritance, and my place, not with noise or desperation, but with the quiet strength of strategy and silence. The seed of retaliation, grounded in empowerment rather than spite, had taken root. The decision to act came slowly, but with a resolute finality. I laid everything bare to Daniel one evening, his steady presence a balm to my raw nerves. I told him about the plan forming in my mind. Silence as my weapon. No more explanations. No more pleading or justifications. I would withdraw from family gatherings, stop the endless emotional labor, and let them feel the consequences of their cruelty. Marcus, ever cautious but undeniably loyal, offered his support discreetly. He promised to gather information quietly, to watch and listen without drawing attention. Together, we began mapping out a strategy, combing through legal documents, auditing financial records, and documenting Eleanor's manipulations with careful precision. Daniel advised patience, reminding me that precision and timing would be my greatest allies. The next Sunday dinner, I stayed home. The absence was palpable, a silent statement louder than any argument. This was my turning point. From reactivity to strategy, from victim to architect of my own defense. My secret power, once a passive knowledge of intricacies, was now a weapon poised for battle. The plan was clear. Make Eleanor and the family reckon with the vacuum my silence created until justice was restored. Late into one restless night, Daniel and I spread out stacks of paperwork and digital files across the dining table, turning our home into a war room. Marcus sat beside me, his brows furrowed as he scrolled through old emails and scanned bank statements. The weight of decades of unpaid debts and unacknowledged favors pressed down like a physical burden. I was shocked to uncover a trove of forgotten wedding loans I'd extended to Eleanor, over $50,000 that had never been repaid, buried beneath excuses and silence. There were more than a few instances where she'd claimed financial hardship, yet the emails revealed flashes of reckless spending, late-night online shopping sprees, luxury dinners, frivolous vacations. It was a portrait of denial disguised as hardship, a stark contrast to the facade she presented to the family. We pored over the trust documents, my fingers tracing the fine print I'd studied so many times before. There were clauses Eleanor hadn't noticed, loopholes about executor challenges and conditions for removal. My heart quickened. These were potential weapons if used correctly. Late calls to my lawyer friend confirmed my suspicions. Eleanor's claims of mental instability were shaky at best, and the doctored medical report could be contested with the right evidence. Marcus, growing more invested, uncovered a thread of old emails where Eleanor was caught manipulating family members, twisting narratives to her benefit. The trail was clear. Her credibility was fragile, a house of cards built on lies and jealousy. As the night deepened, we cataloged family gatherings I'd coordinated, fundraising events, caregiving schedules, legal consultations, countless hours of invisible labor that Eleanor had quietly claimed as her own. The truth of my contributions was buried beneath her shadow, yet this knowledge was no longer a source of pain but a sharpened blade. My silence, once a shield against the family's cruelty, now felt like armor, and my understanding of their vulnerabilities was the sword I wielded in the dark. The calculations and careful record-keeping that had once been mere habit had transformed into a blueprint for justice. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. The battlefield was mapped, and I was ready to move. Despite the turmoil stirring inside me, I kept my calm during the daylight hours. Maintaining the facade was exhausting, but necessary. I locked down my financial accounts, changing passwords and setting up alerts to catch any unauthorized activity. Daniel handled the legal side, alerting my lawyer about the harassment and unauthorized freezes on trust funds. I drafted a formal challenge to the use of the mental health clause against me, gathering every medical record that contradicted Eleanor's accusations. At work, I tread carefully. No rumors, no slips. My professional reputation was a fragile lifeline I could not afford to sever. At home, I cut off family calls from Eleanor and her allies, blocking numbers with quiet resolve. Daniel became my rock, managing household logistics and offering unwavering moral support. The house was an island of calm amid the storm. My silence became a deliberate tactic. I refused to engage emotionally or respond to provocations. Each unanswered call was a message. The family, used to leaning on me as their invisible backbone, now faced a void. Their desperation was palpable in the hushed tones at gatherings I no longer attended. The emptiness I left behind was a quiet but potent form of resistance. As the walls closed in, I realized that withdrawing was not surrender, but strategy, forcing them to reckon with the true cost of their betrayal. The tension simmered beneath the surface, a silent warning that the storm was far from over. My patience and poise masked the fierce resolve building within. I was no longer the exhausted peacemaker, but a woman preparing to reclaim her place on her own terms. One Sunday evening, as the family gathered without me, Marcus approached quietly, his face shadowed with a mixture of guilt and relief. In a hushed voice, he confessed the truth. He had switched sides. His conscience had become unbearable, and he had unearthed a cache of emails and documents exposing Eleanor's web of lies. Among the papers were proofs of forged medical reports and manipulative correspondence with the family attorney, designed to discredit me and strengthen Eleanor's claim to the inheritance. I couldn't stay silent anymore, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of his admission pressed down on me, equal parts shock and hope. His hesitation had been real, but now his loyalty was mine, and with it came a powerful new weapon. This revelation shifted everything. Eleanor's house of cards was crumbling, her credibility undermined not just by me but by family blood. The evidence of her deceit and financial irresponsibility was explosive, threatening to rewrite the family's allegiance and expose the truth behind her polished mask. Marcus's defection was no dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, profound betrayal that carried far more weight. It was an authentic turning point, discovered through careful observation, rather than overt confrontation. The balance of power in the family began tilting beneath our feet, subtle but undeniable. My mind reeled with the possibilities. With Marcus's insider knowledge and the trove of evidence, I could dismantle Eleanor's narrative piece by piece. The emotional weight of years of isolation began to lift slightly as I realized I was no longer alone. The family's whispered doubts were beginning to surface, questions planted by the evidence Marcus had shared discreetly with trusted relatives and the family lawyer. The fragile alliances Eleanor had built were starting to crack. For the first time, I felt the scales of justice swing in my favor. Fueled by truth and quiet strength, the stage was set for the next phase, a slow, deliberate unraveling of the lies that had poisoned my family. The moment I fully withdrew was the moment the family truly felt the loss of their invisible backbone. I stopped responding to calls, cut off all financial support, and refused invitations to family events. Each absence was a calculated move, a void that grew heavier with every ignored request. Daniel sent a formal notice to the trustee, alerting them to Eleanor's illegal attempts to block my access to the trust's funds. Meanwhile, Marcus distributed the damning documents quietly to the family lawyer and a select few relatives who could be trusted to understand the gravity of the situation. Eleanor, still blind to the shifting tides, continued her attacks with the same venom, unaware that her grip was loosening. Without me managing the financial lifelines, family events began to unravel. Unpaid bills surfaced, caregiving schedules fell into disarray, and the once organized gatherings became chaotic. The cracks in Eleanor's facade deepened as questions and suspicions stirred among relatives. The first public consequence hit like a blow. A family fundraiser Eleanor had orchestrated collapsed spectacularly when I withdrew my financial backing at the last minute. The embarrassment was palpable, and whispers of mismanagement and deceit spread like wildfire. Eleanor's attempts to rally support faltered as the truth seeped into the open. I watched from the sidelines, my silence louder than any argument. The family was forced to confront what my presence had always masked, the cost of their betrayal and the price of their greed. The quiet chaos was a reckoning, and though the full consequences were yet to unfold, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. For the first time in years, I felt the cold satisfaction of control returning to my hands. The storm I had become was no longer distant. It was here, and the family was beginning to see the price of crossing me. The room was packed. Too many faces, too many eyes trained on me as the trustee called the family meeting to order. I sat quietly at first, letting the tension fill the space like a heavy fog. The polished wood of the conference table gleamed under the bright lights, but it was nothing compared to the stark glare of truth about to be unveiled. Marcus sat beside me, his presence a quiet but significant comfort. The atmosphere thrummed with a mixture of anticipation and dread, especially from Eleanor, whose usual confidence seemed brittle today. The lawyer began methodically, projecting the emails Marcus had uncovered onto the screen. Messages where Eleanor twisted stories, lied about expenses, and even manipulated medical professionals to forge false reports of my mental instability. Murmurs rippled through the room as relatives exchanged stunned glances. Eleanor's face, once a mask of smug superiority, began to falter. Her breath hitched, and her practiced smile slipped into a faint tremor. I waited until the evidence had spoken loudly enough before I broke the silence. My voice was calm, even, a steady ripple cutting through the charged air. I have been labeled unstable to erase my rightful place in this family and inheritance, I said, locking eyes with those who had turned a blind eye to years of sacrifice. But truth and integrity cannot be silenced. I outlined the decades of invisible labor, the financial support I gave without a word, the emotional weight I bore while Eleanor plotted in shadows. I described the loans buried beneath family smiles, the unpaid debts that tethered me to a role I never asked for. As I spoke, I watched Eleanor's attempts to interrupt falter, her defensive deflections crumbling under the weight of facts. Witnesses nodded slowly. Even Grace's smug posture softened into uncertainty. The trustee's voice cut through the room's silence, announcing that Eleanor's position as executor was suspended pending a full investigation. The power had shifted. I felt it in the collective breath held, in the way the room seemed to lean toward me, finally seeing. This wasn't just a victory. It was my champagne moment, a public reclaiming of my dignity and rightful place. Eleanor's world unraveled with a speed that was almost dizzying. Behind closed doors, family members cornered her with questions sharp and unforgiving. I ignored the frantic texts and tearful calls she sent me, pleas thick with false remorse and desperate promises of change. She tried to woo Grace and others with gifts, apologies heavy with manipulation, but none of it pierced the armor I'd built around myself. The trustee, meantime, froze her access to the trust's funds, cutting off the financial lifelines she'd long abused. Whispers spread quickly. Her reckless spending, her lies, the forged medical documents, all out in the open now. The cousin who once commanded attention found herself isolated, her allies shrinking like shadows at dusk. I watched as those who had once enabled her slowly shifted their loyalty back to me, a quiet realignment of fractured family ties. Daniel's steady support and Marcus's newfound allegiance fortified my resolve. The consequences Eleanor had tried to control slipped through her fingers, twisting like a knife of poetic justice. My silence had been a calculated weapon, and now the damage it inflicted was undeniable. Despite the collapse of her facade, Eleanor refused to yield quietly. She unleashed a last-ditch campaign, marshaling distant relatives and old family friends to bombard me with letters, phone calls, and desperate pleas for reconciliation. They arrived like a storm of noise, false promises, fabricated stories meant to sow discord between me and my allies. Thinly veiled threats lurked beneath some of the messages, hinting at exposing supposed past struggles to undermine me. But I was ready. With Daniel's counsel and the legal team's guidance, I blocked every channel, meticulously documenting each interaction. The more she tried, the more isolated she became. Her once loyal flying monkeys turned away, disillusioned by her desperation. Marcus and Daniel stood unwavering, their faith in me unshaken. Eleanor's theatrics, her manipulation, her threats, fell flat against the wall of my quiet strength. I realized then that my silence, combined with strategic exposure, had dismantled her influence far more effectively than any loud confrontation could have. This was not chaos. It was calculated justice served in the cold light of truth. With Eleanor sidelined, the family slowly began to heal. The trust fund was restored under my control, with clear safeguards to prevent any future manipulations. Sunday dinners resumed, but the air was different. Respect replaced the old undercurrents of derision and dismissal. Grace, humbled by the revelations, took tentative steps toward reconciliation, her gaze no longer so distant. Marcus grew closer, his pride in standing by my side evident in quiet moments. Daniel and I, bonded by the shared storm, found new depths in our partnership. Alone in the calm of my home, I reflected on the journey, from the invisible, responsible one, to a woman who had reclaimed her voice and her boundaries. The family's toxic patterns were not erased overnight, but the balance had shifted irrevocably. Eleanor, stripped of power and trust, became a cautionary figure in our story. And me? I looked forward with hope. Hope rooted not in revenge, but in peace, dignity, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing my worth. The fight had been long and painful, but this victory, patient, precise, and silent, was wholly mine.